A man ran out of money in the forest. Building a house would have taken weeks he didn't have. Then he found something already standing, 15 feet long, stronger than wood, and very dead. What he did next kept him alive through winter. He didn't arrive with a plan to build anything permanent. That matters, because this story doesn't begin with ambition. It begins with limitation. When he left the last town, the money he had left wouldn't last more than a few weeks. Rent had already beaten him. Temporary work had dried up. The truck he drove was old enough that long distances were a risk. So he stopped where the road thinned into nothing, where a shallow river cut through forest dense enough to block wind and noise. The goal was simple: stay dry, stay hidden, stretch time. He pitched a tent the first night, then another, quickly realizing what the numbers already suggested. The ground stayed wet. Nights dropped below comfort fast. Firewood took hours to gather with hand tools. Calories burned faster than food disappeared. He was spending nearly 3,500 calories a day just staying warm and moving, while eating barely enough to replace half of it. Survival math was already turning against him. On the 8th day, while following the river upstream to find a better water access point, he noticed the smell before the shape. Not rot, old rot. The kind that had already passed its dangerous stage. Then the trees opened slightly, and there it was, a massive skeleton partially reclaimed by the forest. The elephant had clearly been dead for years. Moss layered the spine, ferns grew between ribs. The skull leaned into the soil like a collapsed hill. He didn't recognize it as usable immediately. He walked around it first, measured it the only way he could, steps. 15 long steps, nose to tail, rib height taller than him, bone density still solid when struck with the back of an axe. No fresh scavenger marks, no collapse. What caught his attention wasn't the size, it was the geometry. The ribs formed a natural vaulted frame, the spine shed rain. The interior space was elevated above pooled water. Wind passed around it, not through it. He sat there for nearly an hour, doing nothing dramatic, just watching how air moved, how light entered through the ribs, how the forest treated it. Birds didn't avoid it. Insects lived on it. The ground inside was drier than where his tent stood. That was the first calculation. Shelter isn't about beauty, it's about reducing loss. Heat loss, energy loss, time loss. Building a cabin from scratch with only an axe, a handsaw, rope, and less than $2,500 in cash would take weeks he didn't have. Using something already standing cut that time in half immediately. No trees needed to be felled, no roof needed framing. The structure already existed. That night he didn't move in. He tested it. He dragged his tarp inside and laid it flat. Hung a single lantern from a rib using rope he already had. No fire, no modifications, just presence. The temperature inside dropped slower than outside after sunset. Wind noise softened. Rain later that night didn't reach the ground beneath the ribs. When he checked his watch at dawn, he realized he'd slept almost 6 hours straight, more than any night since he arrived. That was the second calculation. Sleep equals recovery. Recovery equals survival. By morning, the decision wasn't emotional. It was mechanical. Staying in the tent meant burning through food and strength faster than he could replace them. Using the bones meant shifting effort from endurance to construction. He took inventory immediately. Tools, axe, folding saw, knife, rope, tarp, one lantern. Before moving anything, he marked the area, cleared loose debris, identified which ribs were load-bearing and which could be reinforced later. He checked the ground slope to plan drainage. He noted where morning light entered and where cold pooled at night. This wasn't a dream build, it was triage. The first goal wasn't comfort, it was safety. Dry ground, stable overhead mass, a place where fire could be managed without smoke filling the space. By the end of that day, his tent was gone. Everything he owned sat inside the ribcage of a dead elephant, and for the first time since leaving town, the math stopped getting worse. It wasn't a house yet. It wasn't even shelter by most standards. But it was a place that didn't demand more from him than it gave back, and that was enough to begin. The second part of the work had nothing to do with comfort. Comfort comes later, if it comes at all. This stage was about removing risk, because anything left unchecked in the forest eventually becomes a problem. The elephant had been dead long enough that the dangerous decay phase was over, but over doesn't mean clean. There were still pockets of hardened tissue, old sinew fused to bone, insect colonies nested deep in joints. Leaving any of that would invite predators, disease, and constant disturbance. He started early each morning, working in short, controlled sessions to avoid injury. A mistake out here wouldn't mean inconvenience, it would mean failure. The first 4 days were spent clearing and sanitizing. He didn't try to strip everything, he focused only on the interior and contact points. Using the back of the axe and a knife, he removed remaining organic material within reach, then burned it well away from the structure. Fire was never lit inside during this phase. Smoke lingers in bone cavities and smell travels farther than sound. To reduce bacteria and insects, he mixed wood ash with crushed charcoal and rubbed it into the interior bone surfaces, where his body or bedding would later touch. Lime would have worked better, but ash was free and immediately available. The cost for sanitation materials during this phase was minimal, around $20 total for salt and a small bag of powdered lime picked up during a short resupply run, but the labor cost was heavy. Roughly 35 hours of slow, exhausting work spread across a week. Once the interior was safe enough to occupy long-term, he shifted to stabilization. Elephant ribs are strong, but strength doesn't equal permanence when exposed to weather. 2 ribs on the windward side showed signs of stress cracking, likely from freeze-thaw cycles over the years. He didn't try to replace them, instead he braced them. Fallen hardwood logs were cut and shaped into vertical supports, wedged tightly between ground and rib, then lashed in place using rope and natural fiber stripped from bark. This alone took another 20 hours of labor, mostly cutting and fitting by hand. Rope usage increased fast, nearly 150 feet gone in reinforcement alone, representing about $45 of material. The ground inside was the next problem. Bare soil meant moisture, insects, and cold. Digging it out wasn't an option. He leveled it instead, scraping away high spots and filling low ones with gravel collected from the riverbed a quarter-mile away. Each trip took time and energy. He made dozens. On top of that base, he laid rough planks salvaged from storm-fallen trees, split and flattened by hand. They weren't pretty. They weren't even. But they lifted his body off the ground. That single change reduced nighttime heat loss dramatically. Floor construction took approximately 15 hours, but it changed everything. By the end of the second week, the interior had a defined shape. The space was no longer something he crouched inside, it was something he stood within. He repositioned the lantern to hang from the center rib, improving light spread. He marked zones mentally: sleeping area, tool storage, fire-safe boundary. Fire still stayed outside, but he tested heat movement by building a small reflector wall of stone near the opening. Even without flame inside, radiant warmth began reaching deeper into the structure during evenings. The internal temperature held roughly 8 to 10 degrees warmer than outside, enough to matter. The survival math shifted again. Daily calorie burn dropped slightly because he wasn't fighting moisture and wind all night. Food consumption stabilized. Cash remaining after materials and one short supply run sat around $950. Tools showed wear but held. More importantly, time stopped being something that attacked him. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving the forest, he was shaping his place within it. The elephant structure had crossed a line. It wasn't just shelter anymore. It was stable, and stability out here is the difference between lasting another week and lasting an entire season. Once the structure stopped threatening him, The work changed. It became quieter, more deliberate. This was no longer about reacting to danger, but about reducing daily effort, because effort is what kills people slowly in the wild. Every unnecessary movement burns calories. Every cold night compounds fatigue. The goal of this phase was simple: make the shelter give back more than it took. He started with insulation, because warmth multiplies everything else. Using bark stripped from fallen trees, packed moss and animal hides traded from a trapper who passed through the area once a month, he layered the inner rib walls. Each layer served a purpose. Bark blocked wind, moss trapped air, hides reduced radiant heat loss. The materials themselves were mostly free, but the trade wasn't. He gave up stored food and $120 in cash to get 2 large hides. It was expensive, but the math made sense. One bad week of cold could cost more calories than the hides would save across a month. Installing insulation took roughly 20 hours of labor spread over several days. He worked in short bursts to avoid mistakes. The ribs weren't straight, and nothing was symmetrical. Everything had to be fitted by hand, tied and wedged instead of nailed where possible to avoid splitting bone. By the time he finished, wind no longer flowed freely through the structure. At night, the lantern heat stayed inside instead of vanishing upward. Indoor temperatures now averaged 12 to 15 degrees warmer than outside, even without fire inside the space. The bed came next, because sleep quality dictates everything else. He built it raised, about 18 inches off the floor, using lashed timber and cross-braced supports. Beneath it, he stored firewood to keep it dry and accessible. On top, he layered woven branches, then hides, then wool blankets purchased during another careful resupply run. Bedding and blankets cost him around $120. The bed itself took about 10 hours to build. The first night he slept on it, he didn't wake up shivering. That alone justified the time and cost. Fire was still the biggest risk. He never brought open flame fully inside. Instead, he refined the exterior fire setup. A shallow fire pit was positioned just outside the rib opening, with a stone reflector angled inward. Heat rolled through the entrance and pooled along the floor before rising slowly. Smoke stayed outside. It wasn't perfect, but it was controlled. Experimenting with fire placement, reflector angles, and fuel types took another 12 hours over several nights. Wood consumption averaged 20 to 25 pounds per day in colder weather, but the effort to gather it dropped now that storage and access were optimized. Storage systems followed. Food was hung high between ribs, using rope and scrapwood out of reach of ground animals. Tools were kept in fixed positions to reduce wasted movement. Water containers sat near the entrance for easy refilling. Lanterns increased from 1 to 3, costing about $50 total, but reducing strain and mistakes after dark. A small cooking setup using metal cookware, another $70, allowed him to prepare meals faster and waste less fuel. By the end of this phase, daily life had a rhythm. Wake, check fire, gather water, maintain structure, rest, prepare food. Work averaged 6 to 7 hours per day instead of the constant 12-hour struggle of the first weeks. Calorie burn dropped closer to intake. Cash remaining hovered around $600. More importantly, the shelter now functioned even when he did nothing. It held warmth. It stayed dry. It protected his supplies. The elephant bones, reinforced and lined, had become something unexpected, not a symbol, not a curiosity, but a working home. And that's when the real test began. Because survival isn't proven in good conditions. It's proven when conditions turn against you. Winter was approaching, and food, not shelter, was about to become the hardest equation of all. By the time winter settled in, the shelter had already proven one thing clearly. It worked. Wind no longer tore through the space. Rain never touched the floor. Nights stayed survivable without burning excessive fuel, but winter doesn't care about structures. It cares about calories. And that's where the real pressure began, because food doesn't arrive on its own, and hunger compounds faster than cold. He entered winter with supplies calculated tightly, not optimistically. Stored food would last roughly 3 weeks at reduced intake. Trapping supplemented that, but trapping is inconsistent, especially in deep cold. Some days produced nothing. Others brought enough to stretch a little further. Costs continued even off-grid. Fuel gathering took 2 to 3 hours every other day. Food trades with the trapper cost cash or labor. Over 3 winter months, his ongoing expenses averaged between $80 and $120 per month, mostly for staple food, salt, oil, and replacement lantern fuel. Compared to city rent, it was nothing. Compared to his physical reserves, it was still expensive. By late winter, his remaining cash dropped below $300. At that point, money stopped being a tool and became a timer. The structure itself held up. Bone, when kept dry, proved stronger than expected. Minor shifts happened during freeze-thaw cycles, but the reinforced ribs absorbed stress without failure. He spent about 1 hour a day on maintenance, tightening lashings, adjusting insulation, clearing snow from the exterior spine. Injuries were the constant threat. One deep cut, one broken hand, and the system would collapse immediately. He worked slower because of that, accepting inefficiency over risk. Mentally, isolation weighed heavier than hunger. Weeks passed without seeing another person. Sound became rare enough that his own movements felt loud. The shelter protected his body, but it didn't distract his mind. There were days when he considered leaving, not because the place failed, but because he was tired of holding everything together alone. Survival isn't just about enduring hardship, it's about deciding whether the trade is still worth it. By the end of winter, the numbers were clear. The shelter had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It reduced exposure, stabilized sleep, conserved energy, and bought time. It did not create abundance. It did not make life easy. When spring came, he didn't rush to leave. He also didn't plan to stay forever. The forest had given him shelter, and he had respected its limits. That was the balance. The house inside the bones didn't save him. It gave him enough stability to decide what came next. And in survival, that choice, still having options, is the rarest luxury of all.